Welcome back to the Purple Worm podcast, a podcast where four British guys get together and talk about role-playing with a UK-centric slant. Now we're going to be talking about fighting fantasy in this episode, but before we get on to that, Pete Jones is going to answer a few of the voicemails that we've received here at the Purple Worm.
And we have our first call in, so take it away, guys.
Hi, fellas. Just wanted to congratulate you on the first episode. Really fantastic idea. Really engaging episode. And very much looking forward to your continued journey into the weird. Take care.
Congratulations, Spencer, also known as Free For All. You are our first call in to the Purple Worm podcast.
This is a good episode. Thanks very much for putting it together. I was thinking about your discussions on random generation and narrative, and I think that it's good to have some random generation going on, but if you want to have a strong story, then having a lot of random generation can obscure that and make it less effective. So I think a balance between having random generation and having a narrative you're trying to follow is a good thing to do if you can do it. So really interesting discussion. Thanks.
Hey guys, Jason here, Nerds RPG Variety Cast. Really enjoyed the first segment of Purple Worm. I look forward to when you actually get into the weird games. Kickstarter stuff is interesting. I'm kind of off Kickstarter and different OSR stuff at the moment. I mean, I love OSR, but I've spent thousands of dollars on Kickstarter. I'm a super backer, and I'm kind of done with that now that I've just blown a couple $100 on Advanced Fighting Fantasy. Thanks, Dave. But and I've got dozens of different versions of the OSR rules, the BX rules and stuff. And I don't know. I'm almost burnt out on buying new rules and trying them. I kind of want to settle down on a single set of rules. Arlen Walker has offered to let me join their Tuesday night Pathfinder 2 game, which is great. It's Sword and Sorcery game, which is a genre I love. And I'm going to take them up on it, but, that means I have to buy Pathfinder 2 and read that. I don't know. There's so many systems. I'd like to hear your thoughts maybe a little more on all these different systems. I'm constantly buying new systems. And I know you can borrow pieces and parts of it, but it gets to be overwhelming at some point. At some point, you just want to retreat back to Delving Deeper or the Black Hack and just stay there, right? So, I don't know. Anyway, great job. Enjoy listening to it, and I look forward to future segments. Oh, and I guess one postscript. So, Colin was asking, you guys were talking about randomly generated treasure, and Colin was asking about that. You probably know this, Colin, but in Cody M's game, Baramay's game, using Delving Deeper, he's using that for the treasure. He's using totally random stuff. He's using the Baramay's game, but he's using random treasure tables, which is how we got like the Gauntlet of X-ray vision, so we can scan the rooms ahead of time. That wasn't planned. That was just came up on a random table. So that is being used, and it's used very successfully in that game. Anyhow, I'll let you go now. Take care.
The first call in there was from Paul Drury, and the second one was from Jason, and I've tied them together because they both cover similar sort of ground. First of all, let's address the random tables. I agree, if you're going to run a completely random tables, random generation, random monster creation, random treasure, you're not going to get a coherent story. You might get some adventure, you might get some excitement, and something unexpected, but you're not going to get a story or a background. So yeah, I am in agreement with you that random tables are a great addition to a background or to an ongoing story. But don't forget, you can also tailor your random tables to fit in with the background. And an example of this is in the Stonehell dungeon I'm running. There is a theme running through the dungeon and a backstory, and my players recently got to a load of crypts, and each one of these crypts is randomly rolled. So there's a choice of 4 different types of creatures in there, and there's also a random roll to see if there's any treasure in there. So this does keep it in line with the story, but it also gives a little bit of excitement to the GM, because the GM's not quite sure what's coming up, if there's anything at all. And we have had empty rooms, and we've had 2 or 3 rooms where hundreds of rats have been pouring out. So I think you're both right there that there is need to mix random tables with your background and your story, and to tailor your random tables. And Jason, as a Kickstarter, I think many of us on here and listening have been sucked into the old Kickstarter thing. And yes, we've all got too many rules. We've got too many board games if you're a board gamer, too many war games figures if you're a war game figure. It sort of seems to grow exponentially. And no, you don't always get to play with them all. And I think, especially with role play rules, people buy them for inspiration, for little snippets of background or something cool that they can add to their own game. So I don't think any of us will ever find the panacea of that perfect game, but we always keep on looking.
Thanks very much for answering those voicemails, Pete, and for everyone who sent in voicemails. It really is greatly appreciated, and we're going to try and get around to answering them as quickly as we can and dotting the responses in amongst our episodes. So please don't feel we're ignoring your voicemails if it takes us a little bit of time to get round to them. But now we're going to move on to talking about fighting fantasy, which is the main point of this episode. Welcome to the Purple Worm. Obviously, this is myself, John from Red Dice Diaries. We've got Pete Jones, Colin Green, and Dave Aldrich from Dragons Are Real, Spike Pit, and Deep Centaur, respectively. And today we're going to be talking about fighting fantasy, obviously looking at fantasy more from a British perspective. Oh, we've got... You're out there, Pete?
I keep dropping out. I'm dropping out for some reason.
Yeah, you do keep freezing up a little bit, but then you keep coming back in like a few seconds later. So we're going to be talking about fighting fantasy from a slightly more sort of British perspective. Now, I've got to confess that I'm not massively up on the history of fighting fantasy, although I've been reading them since I was a wee lad, so to speak. So I don't know if someone wants to take over and give us like a brief rundown of the history of fighting fantasy, just to sort of set us up.
I might drop someone in it because... Oh, go on then, Pete. Yeah, I was going to say that Colin was there from the start. You can remember the releases of these books, can't you? You were buying them. But yeah, Pete, give us a rundown.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, it was... the fighting fantasy are the brainchild of Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson, the British Steve Jackson. And these were the guys that formed Games Workshop back in 1975. And they got the UK rights to distribute Dungeons and Dragons. And the two of them decided that they wanted to release their own version, their own book of rules. And the idea was that they were going to release their own game book and approach Puffin Publishing. And Puffin gave them the green light. But somehow along the way, they wrote the Warlock of Firetop Mountain, which was a game book, the first of the game books, which had the rules in, but had a complete adventure in. And that was released in 1992. What most people don't realise is that first book was the only book that Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone wrote together. After that, they went on their own separate ways. And they released 58 books over the next 13 years before at some point they decided that they wanted to write a book specifically with the rules in as a standalone, and that is when the very first fighting fantasy book came into being. I don't know if anybody else wants to say anything else.
Well, no, I think you're going strong there, Peter. I can see Colin's like champing at the bit to get in there, so...
Yeah, I was just going to make a slight correction there. It was 1982. Pete just said 92, so to avoid confusion.
Yeah, it was 82.
80, 90, OCR, OSR, whatever.
I was going to say give us a break, guys. I was only 2 then. So.
Yeah.
Live fact checking. You know, this is a professional outfit.
If only we'd got like a Google Doc full of notes or something.
Oh yeah, if only. I thought when I was looking at this, when we were talking about putting it together, I thought the amazing stat that stood out to me was the 17 million copies in worldwide copies, but in 30 different languages, man.
Yeah.
I wonder how many game books achieved that.
I wonder how many normal books achieve that. Never mind game books, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, and then the big addition to that is that there have been a couple of relaunches over the years where they've reprinted back through the list, but the current relaunch with Scholastic Books really has become a massive phenomenon. I only know about the UK, but it's sort of relaunched Ian Livingstone's public appearances at cons career after he'd moved away to other things, and these are massive in schools now as a sort of literacy phenomenon, a way into reading phenomenon. So they're still going strong now. They're reprinting them, commissioning new ones. Ian Livingstone's written new ones. Charlie Higson was commissioned to write one. So they are they're promising to be a new sort of cultural explosion.
Yeah, I remember you talked about this a little bit on Deeper Centre, didn't you, Dave? You were saying like it was weird how now you used to not be able to find them, and they were sort of like maybe like looked down on a little bit, whereas now it's become like a big thing because of like Scholastic Books where they're in schools and stuff like that. And I certainly remember when I was young, if I could, I think there was like one copy of like the Riddling Reaver and maybe like two other Fighting Fantasy books in my local library, none in my school at all. So it was, if you didn't have the money to buy them yourself, it was quite difficult to actually like find them for me when I was sort of young. When I read the Riddling Reaver and I thought, that's a great book, I want to read more, and I had to sort of do the normal wheedling and sort of begging to the parents to get them to like buy me the odd copy. But there didn't really seem to be that many of them in the libraries or sort of available publicly.
No, I used to scour the library like once or twice a week. I'd go to that shelf where they all were just to see if there was a new title someone had brought back or was in there. But also I remember we used to have reading time in English, and you could bring your own book and read it. But you were not allowed to read those because they were not considered to be a proper book. So they were no good for reading time. Whereas now I think approaches to literacy have changed, and people are up for whatever they can do to encourage young children to read. So, in primary schools, secondary schools, you'll see whole displays devoted to these books, which I think is a really positive thing. It obviously tracks the whole the explosion of 5th edition and the resurgence of fantasy in popular culture. The thing they haven't done yet, of course, is that introductory role-playing game hasn't been reprinted or re-released. We know somebody else has got the license for Advanced Fighting Fantasy. We're going to talk about that later. But that seems to be the big missed trick. And if Scholastic Books were to reprint the introductory RPG or to recommission one, write a new one, I think that would be massive because
I was looking at this.
Fifth ed's not for 10-year-olds, is it?
No, I was looking at this, Dave, and it is only since 2017 I think the Scholastic thing happened. So it's not even really 2 years yet. So I'd be surprised if it's not on the cards.
Possibly, yeah.
I mean, if I was a cynical person, and I am, I'd expect that they're probably sort of like test the water, as it were, with ones that are simple like reprints of stuff they've already got, which I'm sure they've got new artwork and stuff like that, like the covers particularly. But in terms of like the actual work they have to do on it, it's going to be sort of fairly minimal compared to like producing an entirely new version of a book. So I expect when they're testing the waters, if that carries on sort of doing really well and being popular, as I hope it does, then they might start sort of broadening what they're doing, commissioning new ones or like maybe reissuing the actual Fighting Fantasy role-play, which I hope they do.
I mean, it's become so acceptable that you'll see English teachers designing schemes of work around branching narrative. So you'll see English teachers building schemes of work off the back of, choose your own adventure in general, but Fighting Fantasy is the one that everybody's reading. And that would be a perfectly legitimate thing for a secondary English teacher to do, which I think is pretty cool.
The school connection is interesting because it's gone full circle for me, because you talk about Warlock of Firetop Mountain. We said it's 82, and as you rightly said, Dave, I was there, And my first exposure to it was we would have the Puffin Book Club leaflet would come round once a term, I believe, and it would show you the books. There'd be a little brief write-up, and then on the back there was you would tick boxes, and then your mum or dad would send a check into the school, and it was all like an envelope thing, and it was just like coins sometimes. Mm-hmm. Or you might not have been able to send coins. I think they might have not allowed that. And I weren't allowed to get it. I weren't allowed to get the Warlock of Firetop Mountain. And then Citadel of Chaos followed on from that a few months later, the next term. And I was like, pleading it. And I had a friend who'd got them. And I was like, oh, man, I really want that book. And I didn't get clearance until Forest of Doom. And that was the first one. And I filled it in. Put my little form in the envelope, took it in, and then what happens is you get the day, when the teacher's going to hand them out because they've got all these books on their desk at the front of the class, and you're sitting there waiting for your name to get called out, and you get your book, and it's got your little order form inside the book, where you've ordered it. It's like your receipt as well. Oh, man, I was stoked to go and get my Forest of Doom from the teacher. I've got finally called out my name.
I've got to admit, I don't really have any memories of anything like that. But I love the way you're describing it. It sounds like something out of a spy movie. You're standing on a wind-blown heath, and the teacher's there like a pile of mysterious Manila envelopes, and it's like the warlock flies at midnight and passes you over a book, and then
that's it.
You ain't seen me, right? And walks off.
Well, it was a satanic panic was going on as well,
right? So
there was some difficulties with that. Fighting Fantasy came in for a bit of flack there. You guys have probably heard me talk about my group. My group got shut down. My D&D group got shut down. I think Fighting Fantasy was a lifeline as well.
I think the original idea was pure brilliance. It was putting the books out through Puffin so that you could get them in your WH Smiths, where you couldn't see anything else game-wise. And then I think the other part of it was that you could play on your own. You could sit at home, you're telling your own story. And I was chatting to the guys at my group the other day, and he said, do you remember the Fighting Fantasy books? And 3 of them said, oh, yeah, they're some of the best times as a kid. And all 3 of them also said, yeah, but we always had 12 stamina, 24 stamina, 12 skill, and 12 luck, because that's the only way you could win the damn game.
Yeah. Well, when we were playing the RPG, when we started playing the Riddle and Reaver, we eventually moved to a point buy system because when you're playing as kids, you always end up having people cheat their stats, don't they? Yeah, I've rolled my own. They turned up, and I think a lot of groups arrive at a point buy because of that thing. I've rolled this character at home, and they've got 12, 24, 12. But interesting what you were saying about W.H. Smiths. I mean, I think that is a massive thing. This is maybe a UK specific thing, but it's worth thinking that for from the 80s, whenever Fighting Fantasy, the introductory role-playing game came out, that was 1984, Steve Jackson's book. I think Riddle and Reaver was 86. And then Out of the Pit and Titan were about the same time. And then for the next 10 years, and Dungeoneer comes out a bit later, for the next 10 years, you had a full RPG in normal paperback size being sold in W.H. Smiths, which is our newsagent you find in all the high streets, all the train stations, everywhere. Affordable size. I mean, that's amazing. I don't think if people even noticed that it was there most of the time. But certainly the introductory role-playing game, I think, sold out and was quite hard to get hold of. I was never able to find a copy. Riddle and Reaver I never saw on the shelf at Smith's, but Dungeoneer was consistently there. Out of the Pit and Titan were always there. Also, Out of the Pit and Titan, you had in the 2 sizes, so you had the big A4-sized books. So they were really distinctive, and they were often sort of pride of place above the game books. Just, for a good 10 years, you could actually buy an RPG in our
high street
well-known newsagent. Quite amazing.
All right, guys, let me float a name out there for you, like the ghost of retail shops past, John Menzies.
Oh no.
I don't know if any of you remember John Menzies. I don't know how you'd best describe them now, but they were like another retail store that's long since disappeared into the mists of time. But they also used to stock the Fighting Fantasy books, and that's where I got my copies of Advanced Fighting Fantasy from. And it's interesting what you were saying there about the bigger versions and the sort of like the smaller versions. Because I remember when I was younger, not having a great deal of money to splash out on stuff like that. But Exactly. So I could never afford like the bigger books, but because they had the littler versions, which were like $3-4.99 or whatever, I was like, oh, I can scrape together like my minimal pocket money, and I can go out and buy a copy of these books. And like you say, certainly for Advanced Fighting Fantasy, for the cost of about £20, you've got 5 books telling you everything you need for like dungeoneering, city adventuring, wilderness adventuring, your monster manual, your
monster
world
manual.
book. It was all there, and literally by the time I'd sort of fully digested one of them, I'd probably saved up enough money to get the other ones in the series. So I was always sort of like, all right, I finished reading Dungeoneer. All right, now I've got enough for Out of the Pit. Right, so now I've got the monsters to go with this. And pretty soon, even if you just had like one of the books, you could start running a role-playing game for like for me. So it was in the 90s I started sort of getting into them. For like a kid's like minimal pocket money in the 90s, I could go, I've got a complete role-play book that I can just like carry around with me. I can read it, on the bus or doing whatever, and you can run it for your mates.
And you didn't have to find a game shop. Yeah,
that's it.
No, you didn't have to find a game shop, and the portability. I mean, we used to use them all the time on holidays. They're a great holiday thing.
Ideal.
To this day, I've just come back and I went out to Tenerife with.
All right, stop bragging. Stop bragging. You have to
it.
slip it in there that you've been in
All
Tenerife.
inclusive, like a 10-day free bar.
Free bar. Yeah.
So it was perfect, man. It just goes in the bag. It's not going to go flat on you. The only thing that can be a little bit of a problem is you do need the daylight or sort of some way to see it, because you can forget that when you're used to looking at screens. You do need some lighting for a book. But at the airport, see, W.H. Smith's, I can't remember because I don't think I was really on planes and that when this was in its major heyday when I was a kid. But there must have been people probably picking these books up at W.H. Smith's in the airport and going to like the Costa del Sol, and these books must have been cropping up across Europe, and
very likely. Yeah.
Maybe they were spreading a little bit that way.
Well, I certainly know you guys talking about, you always set your stats at 12. I certainly know that when I first started reading them, I didn't really sort of understand the whole like game book thing. So I was just sort of like, all right, okay, I'll start reading this, and it'd go, oh, you're fighting against an ogre, make these rolls or whatever. If you win, go to here. And I'd just be like, all right, okay, I've won. Let's go to here. And I wouldn't even bother rolling.
So there's the two big kinds of cheating, aren't they? There's the pass over the fight, pass quickly over the fight, and then there's the old 5-fingered bookmark.
Oh yes,
you're moving through the dungeon. You're not quite sure whether this is the right way to go, or do you drink the potion? Do you not drink the potion? So you have to keep your finger or write down the last location you were at, so that if you die,
it's like
back to that.
It's like my favourite Fight Fantasy book, City of Thieves, where you have to like stop the necromancer Zambar Bone, and the great name for a villain, but the only way to stop him is you have to like shank him with a silver weapon, and then you have to like rub a magic compound made of like 3 different rare ingredients into his like eye sockets, otherwise he like resurrects and kills you. And it's like your chances of finding like the right 3 and the instructions that tell you like which 3 are to use are like fairly minimal. So it was always the old, like, you get to the end, like which compound you're rubbing his eyes, right, stick your finger in the book. Right, let's try this one first. Yeah. Let's try this one next.
Yeah, or the wonderful anti-cheating things that they did, where there's a couple of books where if you have the items, then you have to, convert the letters into numbers and add up the numbers and turn to the paragraph of that total. The anti-cheating one. I thought that's awesome.
You'd also get the ones where it'd be like, oh, if you found the silver sword, to turn to the number which is 3 times the paragraph number where you found the sword.
Yeah, that
and
kind
stuff
of thing.
like that.
Yeah.
Which I was when I first started reading them, because they were like a bit later on, I was always like, how did they know that I was cheating at these? Well played, Fighting Fantasy. Well played.
Yeah, they got smarter, didn't they? Yeah.
But I think even if you weren't sort of like engaging with the game element so much, they were still a fantastic, enjoyable read, even if you were just making the sort of choices. So, 'cause, I mean, I had no real conception when I first started reading them of like, oh, this is like a role play game. So I didn't really know much about role play games. But even just as like, oh, right, okay, yeah, this is just a story where I get to make a few decisions along the way. I still got a great enjoyment out of it. I don't know that I'd have got into role playing games as quickly as I did, because when they first popped up, I was like, oh yeah, this is what it was talking about in Advanced Fighting Fantasy and Fighting Fantasy.
Yeah.
And it sort of springboarded me into that, whereas I don't know that I'd have got into it quite so quickly if I hadn't have had that sort of primer.
Yeah. Can I pick up on that, John? Because there's one thing. So I suppose when I got them, I didn't realise the idea of them. Of course, was that here's an RPG you can play on your own. It's come from Dungeons and Dragons into Solo, whereas I only knew game books. And then when I discovered RPGs, I was like, this is as Steve Jackson describes it in FF, the Introductory Role Playing Game. He says the problem with the game books is you only get 2 or 3 options at the end of a paragraph, whereas when you're playing with your mates, you can do whatever's in your imagination, and it's unconstrained. But I think it's worth. This might seem obvious to us, but I think it's actually worth adding to our little history. Just clarifying that most people will be familiar when they're thinking about fighting fantasy with the Solo game books, and that we've been moving in and out, as Pete briefly introduced at the start, between talking about the Solo game books, of which there were 50 odd, and then a couple of books which were produced off the success of the game books, which specifically introduced an RPG to younger players. So the first one of those was, of course, Steve Jackson's Fighting Fantasy, the Introductory Role-Playing Game, which then had a campaign supplement, The Riddling Reaver. And then you had Titan and Out of the Pit were intended as source books to that.
Yeah.
And then a few years later, you had Advanced Fighting Fantasy, which was 3 books, Dungeoneer, Black Sand, and Alanzia. And Advanced Fighting Fantasy is currently going through a sort of re-release with, I think it's Albion Games are doing that. But I think it's worth saying that because we move in and out, that I've talked to people about the Fighting Fantasy game books and talked about Riddling Reaver, for example, and no one's realised that what I was talking about was an RPG campaign. They just thought it was another one of the game books. So I think it's worth clarifying that.
Yeah, and if you want to get all that, go for it, Pete. Go.
No, something I was just going to mention is the brilliance of the original books was the simplicity of the system of just having 3 stats, and for a young child it was so easy to understand.
And that's it for this episode of The Purple Worm. Thank you very much to all of you who have sent voicemails into us. Hopefully you'll join us next time when we start to talk a little bit more about the mechanics of fighting fantasy. So until then, keep rolling those dice, enjoy whatever you're playing, and watch out for those purple worms.